I'm the founder and executive director of Khalil Center out in Chicago. Started in Chicago 6 years ago, and it's focused as a psychological and spiritual wellness center. And we pioneering the application of Islamic spiritual healing to a modern psychological practice. So it takes a faith-based perspective for addressing Muslim mental health. Um, and so this model is one that I've written and published an article for. I can share that with you if you're interested in a more detailed read, because this is a briefer sort of overview of a presentation. And we utilize this model and we train on it. And what's important about this is that in being effective with Muslims, there's a lot of research and data to support the fact that Muslims want their problems, particularly when we're talking about mental health, because of how personalized this issue is, and how multifaceted it impacts social, familial, occupational lives, their identities, their personalities. So faith is a very important part of how people do meaning making or identity formation or construction of self and relating to others. And being effective with Muslims, one must take into consideration their faith. And we find that most Muslims conceptualize their problems, psychological distress, through a spiritual lens. And the help-seeking attitudes among Muslims is that they predominantly go to imams. We have data on this, and they actually believe in a New York study by Dr. Abu Ras. She noticed that Muslims see the imam as a counselor as well. They see that as part of their occupation, or they didn't say therapist, but a counselor or healer in that way, which is interesting because imams don't have that sort of training, nor do they. I mean, they do a lot of legal kind of textual analysis of rules and ethics, but not really how to help a person deal with given social psychological problems. But this points to the fact that Muslims are conceptualizing their problems, particularly mental health, through a spiritual lens, and in ignoring that, then we might not be effective in addressing the problem. And on that grounds is where Khalil Center has emerged, because we believe that there's this sort of void gap, public health gap of available accessibility to services that cater to Muslim mental health and the Muslim population out there. And what we found is that people, we've become in a very short period of time the leader in Muslim mental health care delivery in the nation, seeing over 600 patients in a given year of psychotherapy, mostly psychotherapy patients. And our data collection finds that the vast majority of these people have never gone to a therapist before, and the vast majority of them would never have gone to a therapist had Khalil Center not been around. And when we look further into why, they want their problems addressed from a spiritually based perspective. And that's what overwhelming 90% of our patient population are seeking this out because of that. Now, this isn't, one might imagine people that look like me then that are going to be looking for this kind of service, and maybe there was a void that didn't really meet that, but that's not the case. Muslims from all walks of life, all different practices, turn to faith and faith-based healers during times of crisis. And I don't think this, again, as Dr. Shah was saying, I don't think this is particularly and only unique to Muslim mental health. This is what Khalil Center is. And I'll talk, let me talk a little bit about Muslim mental health, but I'll come back to integrating it within therapeutic settings. These are just some data points on Muslim mental health. A Pew study finds that American Muslims are less happy than the average American. Some of the factors for that is Islamophobia, adaptation, acculturation, immigration variables, PTSD issues from countries of origin. Anxiety disorders in American Muslims are similar to the prevalence rates in the average American population, about 18%. And then we have for PTSD, we have more Muslims suffering from PTSD because of refugees and political turmoil in their countries of origin. And we also find in a Gallup study that 47% of Muslim college students report using alcohol, and 16% of them binge drink, which is interesting data because, as you may or may not know, for Muslims, the usage of alcohol is culturally sanctioned, and it's a very big taboo. And despite that, almost half the population in college of Muslims are using alcohol, which for Muslims is not normative. So this might be indicative of their particular problems that leads them to these sorts of outlets, even though it's sanctioned within their cultural faith-based groups. American Muslim divorce rates, we're doing a little bit better than the average population, 32% according to an estimate by UNIS. And then the better study was one that was done in the Bay Area, but mind you, the population there was a middle class, well-to-do kind of Bay Area sample, highly educated, young, mostly professional, middle class kind of demographic, and we had about 21%. Now, just because they're married doesn't necessarily mean they're doing very well in their marriages. 68% of those people who are married among Muslims have significantly negative interactions, and 56% report at least one moderate to major issue in their marriages. So they might be less likely to get divorced, but maybe just as likely to have marital problems. And so again, when we're kind of circling back into these problems, the need we're addressing, and that there's a need. I'm demonstrating the point that I'm trying to demonstrate is that Muslims got issues, right? And they need, and so what do they do with those issues? Well, just like the average population, Muslims as well as the average population, Americans generally cope through religion. I mean, you could probably relate to this. When people go through crisis, they tend to turn to faith, right, for answers and solace and seeking of assistance, and maybe faith-based healers as well. Because we find that 90% of people surveyed, after 9/11, asked how did they cope with 9/11, including Muslims, by the way. 90% of them turned to religion, said that they found solace in coping through religion. Many people with medical illnesses seek out alternative forms of therapy that include prayer, exercise, ritual, traditional healers. This is just the average American population. And in medical treatment settings, a significant number of people report the desire for a greater integration of religion and spiritual care. 80% of a sample of mentally ill patients report using religious coping. So religion and spirituality is really important for meaning making for human beings in general, and I think for Muslims even more so because of the salience of that religious identity. Furthermore, 48% of patients would like their physicians to pray with them. We don't generally think of physicians as traditional healers, or that we would see them as people who have expertise in spiritual care. 64% of people believe that their physicians should pray with them if they request. And a survey of 6 mental health centers find that 55% of the average American wants to talk about spirituality in psychotherapy. And as I mentioned, in our samples, we find that over 90% are seeking us out for that reason only.
Those numbers apply to all Americans?
All Americans. This is all Americans. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I've kind of
That's
just
surprisingly high.
Yeah. And this speaks to the fact that though people might not necessarily be, this is what we see in our practice as well, might not necessarily be overtly religious or very devout in their day-to-day given life, But during trials and tribulations or suffering or difficult times, people tend to turn to religion for help. And these are times when people get scared, they need relief, they reassurance, and spiritual care becomes very important for them. So the gap that I alluded to, why don't Muslims, not all Muslims, but a good percentage of Muslims not seek out therapeutic care? Because of the following 6 variables and reasons. That being a mistrust of service providers, fear of treatment itself, fear of racism, discrimination, language barriers, differences in communication, and issues of culture and religion. Our centers, for that matter, target these barriers and try to break down these barriers. And one of our biggest referral sources is Islamic institutions and imams, which is very helpful in being able to fill the void of when people are going to religious practitioners and not being able to get that adequate care, but being able to be referred to a source. And being referred by your religious practitioner is much more powerful because we kind of borrow their credibility, right? So there's a lot of people that come into my office they're like, I'm here because my imam has sent me here. Right? They'll say, Sheikh so-and-so at the masjid over there, he said, credibility.
A lot of patients that say that trust me is like, for God's like, no.
Right, exactly. It's a sort of referral, right?
Yeah.
They come in and you say, they said you could help me with my problems, and sometimes it's even, expectancy and placebo variables are very important in psychology as well, right? So we have people that are coming in that have some projections of what I could do for them. So they come in and they say, my imam told me you are like the person that has the answer to my problems. And they're all ears and they're attentive and they're motivated. And I'm like, this is all of the ingredients necessary to fix a problem, right? So there's some utility in doing that. And we also do pre and post measures in the models that we use. So we do demonstrate that people that walk through our doors, they start in the clinically significant range with it on the BSI, the brief symptom inventory, and by the time they leave, they're in the normative range. So now I'm going to give you a way of thinking about mental health from sort of an alternative perspective that is not dismissive of modern psychology or psychotherapy, but rather can be very much integrated in. But for a moment, you're going to have to sort of step out of your healthcare practitioner worldview on distress and health and pathology, and work with me to redefine this from a different perspective. And then we'll come and circle back around to talking about the role of pathology and healthcare and clinical pathologies within the system. So when we talk about, mental health talks about this is the science of human behavior. And when we're talking about human behavior, we're trying to change human behavior, right? For what? Towards what aim? In a clinical setting, it's symptom relief, right? It's getting them functional, off the charts of the DSM, into the normative range, and back into the world, right? When we think about it from a spiritual perspective, it's a little bit more broader than that, in the sense that health is not necessarily indicated by the absence of pathology. Okay, I'll say that again. Spiritual health is not indicated by the absence of clinical pathologies, right? So a person could be psychologically, not diagnosable by the DSM or ICD of a psychiatric or psychological pathology, but still have a poor character, right? Still, be a jerk, be narcissistic, and that might actually work for them. They're a narcissistic physician that's like some leading physician in some great department and whatnot. But from from a spiritual perspective, that person is sick. And so when we're talking about altering human behavior, we have to think about it in a broader perspective when we're talking about faith. We're talking about, and from an Islamic perspective, and this will, generalize the Abrahamic traditions or even beyond, is really is connection to God, is proximity to God. And the closer we get, the closer you are to health. And the further you are, the more sick you are, and spiritually diseased you might be. And so religion and spirituality has a lot to say about behavior change, and that is the unification, and we call this in psychology cognitive dissonance, right? Unification of your belief system with your behaviors, right? I believe I should act righteously and be this person, but my actual behavior is here. And faith-based practitioners work towards unifying this to try to get you closer to that goal. So, it kind of jumped on me. And from an Islamic perspective, when we talk about that spiritual spectrum, we're talking about either you're going to be at the very base level. It's sort of like what we call in psychology operant conditioning, and that is reward and punishment is the motivation of behavior. That you will, in the same way that you'll reward a child or put them on a levels program or behavior modification program to to socially comply with the school setting, for example. If we think on a macro level, to comply as a good Muslim, as a good believer, there's reward and punishment, and that is hellfire and eternal bliss in Jannah or in paradise, and then a higher level of that is that you don't necessarily, going past the sort of moral development in children. Kohlberg has his moral development stages, going beyond just living for the law. It's living for something beyond that, and that is for God's sake. And so wanting to do for God's sake out of love, not because you fear punishment or that you're seeking a reward from Him. So that's a higher level of faith. And we say this is actually spiritual perfection. In Islamic terminologies, we call this kamal. In Sufism, they call this kamal, like spiritual perfection. A person has reached unification of seeing the world through a God lens, through the God consciousness. So psychological frames of reference is that everything is a manifestation of God. And these people we call generally the awliya, and these are spiritually perfect or very healthy people. And so they are also very resilient to psychological distress, because there's a lot of data to demonstrate that spirituality has a lot to offer in terms of developing resiliency. If a person, for example, is suffering from a difficult trial, for example, they might think to themselves, remember a verse of the Quran, for example. Perhaps you might dislike something, but it's got good in it for you. So you have this hope that there's some spiritual cleansing happening here. I'm getting closer to God because of this illness, even, whether it be physical or psychological or whatnot. So there's a relationship between health, clinical, psychological health, and spirituality. But before I go further with that, I want to make this disclaimer, and that is that there's a relationship, but not always, right? So, and sometimes it's an oversimplification. People say, well, people have psychological problems because of the fact that they don't have enough faith. That's an oversimplification. Spirituality develops resiliency against psychological distress, can help cope and improve health in the same way that it does with medical conditions as well. But there are certain very biologically driven, genetically based autisms and severe psychopathologies and schizophrenias and these sorts of things that are not that have nothing. That doesn't matter how faithful you are. It really doesn't have much of an impact on your on your psychopathology, or it might improve it, but it's not necessarily directly related. And our 9th century boards, I know there's a little bit of debate as to whether this is sort of an acceptable model in modern day psychology, but I really like this system here. This is Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, who wrote a risala, a treatise in the 9th century on psychological disorders. Okay, so preceding the 19th centuries when we're talking about psychological distress, before that, he even has a classification of OCD that one of our providers wrote an article on, comparing the DSM classification of OCD with Abu Zayd al-Balkhi's conceptualization, and it seems to line up very closely preceding the DSM. And he has this sort of exogenous and endogenous manifestation of disorders. Endogenous meaning that it's within, it's predominantly biological, physiological, chemical imbalance sort of origins, etiology, versus the exogenous. And the exogenous is predominantly environmental. So a person has gone through a divorce or lost their job, or had some catastrophe happen to them, and now they're depressed, right? Versus they're depressed because they have genetic predisposition, it runs in their family, it's heritable, severe, chemical imbalances, etc. So this helps to kind of break this down into two fold, because these individuals who are very endogenous, and I recognize on a continuum, are very resistant to environmental psychotherapies, for example. They're going to need some medications, psychiatric medications, to help put them into gear. And it's very useful to have this classification, and he talks about the endogenous needs, more of a what we call in psychiatric care today, and medication management, versus the exogenous needs environmental influences, and that's psychotherapy, for example, and what he would call at the time like a hakim, or a traditional healer, a wise person, like the counsel of a person who's very knowledgeable to help guide you along through this problem. Now, going back to what I was saying earlier, this relationship between spirituality and clinical pathologies. So I've kind of created this here, this continuum chart, for the exogenous range, right? So somebody who is going through distress due to environmental conditions, right? Not biological. So I'm kind of putting the biological aside for a moment, the etiology, because they might not line up this way for that. I would conceptualize that very differently. But on this range, you have manifestations of pathologies to different severities and intensities, right? So you have sadness, for example. Clinical sadness is dysfunctional. It's debilitating. It's a severe subjective psychological distress. It's also dysfunctional in the sense that it compromises your functioning, social, occupational, familial life, right, as defined by the DSM, in the statistically kind of smaller range, or deviating away from the normal range. So we have individuals who are in the clinical range of sadness, and that's we call clinical depression, right? And there needs to be a kind of a specific strategy that's clinically informed to address this issue. Then we have the normal range, and that's sadness in the regular world, and we're talking about grief and divorce and whatnot. Could be now any of those triggers can push somebody into the clinical range, but a normal person might also have regular sadness. And that's approached a little bit differently. And then we'll have the station of the awliya, which is the spiritual perfection, the prophets and the saints and whatnot. Those guys also have sadness, but they see the world completely differently. Their ability to cope with that sadness is very different. So we're still human beings. We have sadness on different ranges of the spectrum. But that kind of sadness might be very adaptive. It might actually cause them to get closer to God, create more meaning out of life, rather than in the clinical range where it's sort of a negative attribution bias, this dark cloud kind of pessimistic worldview that reduces hope for an individual. In the average range, does in this normal range, it doesn't necessarily mean that a person is, again, spiritually healthy, right? This means that it's the absence of clinical pathologies, but they should be working towards the green range. And there they might have narcissistic traits, they might have envy, they might have jealousy, they might have all sorts of character defects that really need some attention. And so at Khalil Center, we want to break this whole idea of that it's only clinical problems that we deal with. And when we take it and employ a sort of faith-based perspective, it's broader, and it's also couched in faith-based languages as well, that automatically destigmatizes, because now when people come to see us, they're not only seeing us for clinical pathologies. I'm going to a psychiatrist or psychologist because of the fact that I'm insane or something's wrong with me, or some people might believe that they're possessed by jinns or whatnot. It's holistic. I'm going there to fix my marriage. I'm going there to fix my coping with life, to get closer to God, whatever it might be. So it actually makes the therapeutic encounter much more engaging and interactive, because we're doing a lot of insight and self-awareness, etc. Now I'm going to talk just a little bit of. I'll give you my model, just an overview of it, and then we'll engage in dialogue. I'm not going to exhaust too much more energy in really theoretically unpacking this.
When you mentioned absence of dysfunction doesn't equal health, is it similar to patients who have cancer that is asymptomatic? Hasn't evolved yet in symptoms?
That's interesting.
Or somebody has a disc problem, big disc herniation that's not causing pain?
Potentially. I mean, I could see how an individual who might have particular characteristics are not having family problems yet. They're not having. Right. They're not having occupational problems yet, social problems yet, right? And it's true, and that might land them into those kind of problems if those character defects are not addressed. And by the way, I'm sorry, we didn't get permission actually for this. Is it okay that he's taking pictures? Or? Yeah, these are actually, Hooman is our community.
Don't give her stomach.
No, mine's actually a community outreach, and part of our sort of community engagement model is that we try to maintain like social media and that sort of thing to be able to get kind of reach the masses in providing access to care, and that's part of what has made us actually successful as well. Yeah.
Yeah, just following up
go
on
ahead.
your question, I think that maybe what you're suggesting is that it could be predictive of future psychological
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
issues. So seeing the physical manifestation can say, oh well, we've got to look for this coming, and how can we kind of
The problem is coming.
Right, because
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
patient is in huge distress, and it's gonna filter out into
Sure.
So you're talking about preventive medicine.
Right. Yeah.
Prevent this from going
Correct.
into a problem.
But I will say that the way that we're talking about this is looking at it through the lens of clinical practitioners, and I agree with you. I think absolutely it makes perfect sense that we might not see it, but there's also the possibility that those negative traits actually become useful to the person in those settings, such as an individual who is, head of a particular department that is somewhat authoritative, and their power, their demeanor actually commands obedience or whatnot, and it works for them, becomes functional to serve their purpose. Now, people might not like them very much, but they don't really feel distressed by it, right? And so for that person, what is the motivation, right? And the motivation then becomes, when we're conceptualizing broader in a spiritual lens, it becomes your spirituality should motivate you enough to be able to have good conduct with these individuals, even if there's no social, occupational, familial, or worldly benefit for it whatsoever, right? So our philosophy of human nature is very important when we talk about psychopathology or psychology and human behavior, because a lot of the theoretical perspectives in psychology are rooted in, I would dare to say, theologies of human nature. Okay? I'm going to say that again. Theologies of human nature, even though they're devoid of religious terminologies, right? And I'll give you an example. Freud, let's start with Rogers, for example. Carl Rogers in the humanistic tradition believes that the human being is inherently good, right? And they believe that the human being is inherently good, and there's not necessarily any bio data or biological, physiological, or genetic data that he has to say that. It's a theoretical kind of assumption, right? That he believes of the goodness of human nature, and his therapy emerges out of that belief. So he believes that my job is to provide a nurturing, accepting environment for that goodness to emerge. Therefore, I don't necessarily have to be directive. It's drawing out from the individual. So that's his perspective on that. And that's the way that he operates. Freud, on the other hand, for example, has this id, ego, superego kind of feud that's happening. And the id is inherently evil. The human being is driven by sexual, impulses and death instinct and whatnot. So he believes that the human being inherently has this animalistic nature that needs to be tamed or kept in control by the ego, balanced through the superego, right, for social acceptability. So. And his therapy emerges out of that, right? What are these repressed needs that we can get out and be cathartic in this environment that can then make you functional so that you don't do it out there, right? Your sexual fantasies and things that come up and the motivations for your behaviors that emerge out of these beastly sort of origins. So many people, and we do a lot of kind of research, and a recent publication we have is on the themes of the literature in discussing Islamic integration into mental health. And we find that a lot of some of the literature finds that a lot of researchers are focusing on trying to take these theoretical constructs and Islamicize them by putting Islamic language to them. But the thing is, I would argue that they might not be compatible in its origins of the conceptualization of the human being. So I start with a conceptualization, then I'll give you sort of a framework, and then we can talk about, and we'll pretty much be done with there. But we have we have the fitra. We believe that the human being is good. Okay. And Islamically, the kullu mawludun yuladu ala al-fitra, that every person is born upon the fitra, a good essence. They have a God, construct and concept internally built into them, and that they seek to be good. Okay, but unlike, and this is sort of this balance of Freud and Rogers here, is that we also have something called the nafs. And the nafs is this it has animalistic properties, but it also has the capacity to be good. So if untamed or untrained, like a horse, for example, if it's not trained, it's not going to be functional to you. It'll be wild. But if it's trained, it'll do service to the fitrah. So you might realize so as a Muslim, you might realize I'm living hedonistically, animalistically, just seeking out sexual gratification or monetary gratification or worldly gratification. But your fitrah gives you this thing like, this doesn't seem right. This doesn't feel right. Okay? And so there's this sort of clash here. And the nafs can be trained, and that's where in Islamic terminologies, we have this behavioral modification we call tahdhib al-nafs. And for centuries, spiritual practitioners have been working on this nafs to train it to build discipline. Such that, and my model was really a tarbiyah model. We call this tarbiyah. What you do is you train this nafs through discipline to eventually adopt healthy behaviors that reinforce health, spiritual health, physical, psychological health. But that requires embracing the discomfort of the formation, right? There's discomfort and resistance in the formation, right? Just like in dieting, for example, you'll have, the pain that you're going to experience by not eating that cheesecake after your dessert is going to be uncomfortable because you have this craving response, or reducing the portions that you're eating. You have to feel hunger in order to be able to know that you're doing something right. And over time, your appetite shrinks and adapts, and you get accustomed to eating that amount of food. But you have to tolerate the pain of the craving, avoiding the craving, the pain of not eating, the pain of the stomach pains and whatnot when you're not eating. In psychological terminologies, we'll say you'll have to tolerate the pain of the absence of the gratification, right? So, for example, a person, might like has anxiety because of the fact that they want to be socially accepted, and they're always anxious, and they always are always anxious in how they conduct themselves because they're afraid of impression management. So what the prescription might be for them, for example, is to go in and do something to compromise that impression management. So actually go in and do a seminar, but just don't prepare for it on an occasion. I mean, something low stakes as well. Obviously, if your job depends on it, we're not going to tell you to do that, right? Or I would tell, for example, a client of mine who was afraid that his employer would find out that he was not very competent. So he would act like he was really competent all the time. But he'd be so anxious that he'd sit in the car to try to compose himself for about half an hour every day before work. Intense anxiety. So I said, here's what you're going to do. Next time your employer gives you a task to do, you're going to say to him, I don't think I have the capacity or the talent or skill set to actually take on this task or project. But you know what I can assure you is that I can certainly put in the effort and try and probably get there. And he's like, you want me to call myself out in front of my employer and tell him that I don't have the capacity to do this? I've been working my whole life on trying to hide the fact that I don't feel very competent in myself. I said, yeah, you have to go against that discomfort and shoot down your nafs, which desires impression management, which desires social desirability, to be well liked and whatnot. To be yourself, to get yourself out there, sort of thing. So that's a discomfort, right? And there's discomfort in forming these behaviors, and they can span all the way from all sorts of things, from behavioral addictions, impulse control, behavioral modification, pornography addictions, for example, phobias, all sorts of things. And then we have, so here I have this composition of the human being. In the middle we have the heart. And then we have the nafs, which is your behavioral inclinations, okay? And then you have your emotions, ihsas. This is a Ghazalian-based construct, by the way. Spirit is your ruh, your spiritual self. Then we have your aql, which is your cognition, your mind. And all of these are intertwined, right? They all impact one another. If you're feeling, sad, let's start with your aql. You have self-esteem issues. You don't believe you're very competent. In the case of my client, then they're going to do compensatory behaviors through their nafs to try to maintain that, and their addiction to kind of maintaining social impressions. Their emotions might be intense fear, intense sadness, right? And spiritually, it might deplete them to feel like that there are instances he doesn't want to pray, he doesn't want to go anywhere. He's kind of, laying in bed sometimes, really not feeding his spirit. And ultimately, all of this impacts the heart. And then according to a prophetic tradition, أَلَا إِنَّ فِي الْجَسَدِ مُضْغَةً إِذَا صَلَحَتْ صَلَحَ الْجَسَدُ كُلُّهُ وَإِذَا فَسَدَ فَسَدَ الْجَسَدُ كُلُّهُ. That the heart is the central piece, that each person has a heart, that if it is right, then everything else will be right. If it's corrupt, then everything else will be corrupt. And in this case, if the heart is where the store of health is, right? All of these things impact the heart, and to clean the heart is by working on this whole entire system, and the manifestations is a clean heart. And in the English language, we use the heart a lot to refer to kind of the self, right? And so the tarbiyah is this this concept of, the heart is in the center of it all, and the goal is to create awareness in Kishaf, self-awareness, help the person get awareness into their own pathologies, into their own triggers of behavior, their own reasons for why they do what they do, and then do i'tidal, and that is balancing. Find what those needs are under those behaviors and cognitions and emotions and whatnot, and to balance that system. So not to go to one extreme or another. In the case of the ruh, for example, we don't have monasticism in Islam. So meaning that you're not going to seclude yourself away from society and just engage in prayer all the time and not feed your body and have social interactions and work, etc. That is unhealthy from an Islamic perspective. And it's not the other extreme either, that you're so depleted that you don't engage spiritually at all, right? So it's finding that appropriate balance. The nafs desires some pleasures, habits, joys, interests. So it's not deprivation of the nafs altogether, but rather it's moderation and training of that nafs. The aql is between fear and hope. You don't want to. There's adaptive sort of fears, and then there's maladaptive fears, right? If a person doesn't fear, not getting into, not failing their exam and what that means about their identity, then they won't prepare for the exam, right? They got to have some fear that's the product of this thought process that induces that motivation to actually prepare for that exam. But if they have too much of it, then that's unhealthy, because then what they're doing is you're not going to be able to focus, right? You're going to be frozen, for example, in those instances. So it's these, balance that we are striking. And this framework really is an integrative framework that allows for, the integration of all of these different therapeutic modalities, whether it be cognitive therapies that are designed to help address the cognitions of the individual, whether it's behavioral modification, whether it's emotion-focused therapy, for example, that's finding the underlying adaptive needs of those emotions, whether it's, spiritual prescriptions in the form of dhikr and prayer and rituals and whatnot that help a person adapt. But, I could speak on this and get really specific, right, down to interventions and how it works. But really, what I wanted to do is give you a framework to really think about mental health when we're talking about it from a faith-based, spiritually integrated perspective that, to me, feels actually much more holistic, because there's always this sort of clash between what is it, cognition or emotion or behavior or this and psychology. But this is really an integrated framework to show that the human being is multifaceted, and that there's going to be a malfunction in one area more than another, which is part of our assessment, and we might target that, but that's also going to impact the entire system. And where you choose to intervene, you might have an effect on the rest of the system, but you want to make sure you're targeting the area of the dysfunction, right? If you got the cancer cells and you're getting them in the places that's not where it's emerging from, you'll help, right? But you're not going to remove the problem itself. So you want to, in your assessment, find where is it? Is it an impulse control issue? Is this emotional dysregulation? Is this a thought process based issue? Is this existential crisis, spiritually devoid, a lack of meaning of life, or a feeling of a depletion of spiritual self, sort of thing? Where is it? And we want to then focus on targeting that, and then we have sets of interventions and have suggestions for how to do that. And when we frame this in this way, it actually becomes empowering for the client, because of the fact that they feel, and I find very often that they feel like this isn't foreign. It's integrative. It's not dismissive. It's the striking of this balance. So where does behavioral science fit in this? Behavioral science definitely fits in the research on cognition, the research on emotion, and Islam is not a faith-based perspective doesn't negate any of this, but is rather very integrative of this. And in fact, in Tasawwuf terminology, it's called this tajraba. Tajraba is experiential knowledge, which for generations, spiritual practitioners have been trying different things out. And what works, they pass it on to their students. Say, you do this too with your students. And today we call that empirical science, right? Putting a person through trials, empirical measures, pre and post tests, seeing whether it was effective. And this is more of the written, sort of the scientific world that has space within the larger sort of faith-based world. And they don't have to be sort of at odds with one another. And so I'll kind of conclude there, and we can engage in some discussion. I know that our time is certainly running out, but I want to give you just kind of a framework for